The Stone Zone, with legendary Republican strategist and political icon and pundit Roger Stone. Stone has served as a senior campaign aide to 3 Republican presidents. He is a New York Times best-selling author and a longtime friend and advisor of President Donald Trump. As an outspoken libertarian, Stone has appeared on thousands of broadcasts, spoken at countless venues, and lectured before the prestigious Oxford Political Union and the Cambridge Union Society. Due to his 4+ decades in the political and cultural arena, Stone has become a pop culture icon. And now, here's your host, Roger Stone.
Welcome, I'm Roger Stone, and yes, you are back in the Stone Zone. Continued controversy of President Donald Trump's appointment of Pete Hegseth, the Fox News commentator and decorated combat veteran, to be Secretary of Defense. To help break this down, let me bring in my co-host for today, the Illinois Business Review founder, publisher, and editor, Mark Vargas.
Roger, good to be with you.
Great to be with you. Well, Mark, you've got a lot of experience in Washington. You've seen this before, the feeding frenzy by the deep state and their allies in the fake news media. Personally, I think Pete Hegseth is fully qualified to be the Secretary of Defense. And the media has him withdrawing, but that doesn't appear to be the case. Here's a video of Pete Hegseth only this morning.
Have you had any conversation about replacing you with Governor DeSantis?
I spoke to the president-elect this morning. He said, keep going, keep fighting. Behind you all the way.
So you're in this all the way.
Why would I back down? I've always been a fighter. I'm here for the war fighters. This is personal passion for me.
You're not withdrawing your name from consideration, just to be clear.
We're meeting all day with senators.
I know your mom was just on Fox. She says that you are a change.
Well, that seems to be very contrary to the mainstream media narrative, which has Hegseth on the verge of withdrawing. It doesn't look to me like a guy who's withdrawing at all. Mark, what do you think?
No, and we're seeing how nasty this confirmation process is when you've got these never-Trumper senators like Mitch McConnell and Susan Collins and Lisa Murkowski, totally ineffective senators. But Roger, I used to work at the Pentagon, working for the Secretary of Defense as a civilian staffer on a special task force. So I'm very familiar with that building and how the Office of Secretary of Defense works. And he is, in fact, overqualified as a decorated combat veteran. But for the mainstream media to be bashing such a decorated and honorable veteran should be no surprise, and trying to claim that other individuals are going to be already taking his place certainly should be no surprise.
Yeah, there was a particularly nasty hatchet piece in the New Yorker regarding Hegseth. I went through it. I think I found 27 specific errors of fact, and then things reported but out of context. Criticism of Hegseth by his own mother, which she withdrew literally years ago. I think this is symptomatic of what we're seeing. You raise an excellent point about these rhino senators, some of them not even rhinos. It was interesting, yesterday afternoon, James Lankford, known in Oklahoma as the Shrimp, the senior senator, and Mark Wayne Mullen, who seems to be more Trump-friendly, initially said that they wouldn't necessarily be voting for Kash Patel as the president's nominee for FBI director. I'm told that both of their offices were so flooded with phone calls from constituents telling them that the president deserves his nominees. Well, by late afternoon, Mark Wayne Mullen, the junior senator, had changed his tune, said he would support Patel, who I saw your show the other day. Patel, I think, is one of the president's very best nominees so far. Speculation at the Wall Street Journal and elsewhere that Governor Ron DeSantis will now replace the nominee, Pete Hegseth. I dug into this first thing this morning. I can tell you, Mark, this is entirely without foundation. Now, I do think it's important because people lose track. When he withdrew from the presidential race, Ron DeSantis has never endorsed Donald Trump for president. If you go back and look at his remarks, what he said was he had concluded that a majority of Republicans favored the renomination of Trump, and therefore he was withdrawing his candidacy. That is not exactly a full-throated endorsement. The truth of the matter is that Ron DeSantis owes his entire career to Donald Trump. He was an undistinguished and largely unknown congressman, running at about 8% in the polls when he was elected in 2018. His opponent, the state agriculture commissioner, Adam Putnam, a former congressman, had been endorsed by all 62 of the Republican county chairmen in Florida, every single Republican in both the state house and the state senate, the all-powerful state senate president, the very powerful speaker of the house, every Republican member of Congress from Florida, with the exception of Matt Gaetz. And his campaign was hopelessly doomed. He was having trouble raising money. He went on bended knee and begged Donald Trump for an endorsement. Trump evidently did not know that in 2016, when DeSantis was running for Congress and Trump was the Republican nominee for president, DeSantis refused to endorse Trump in that election, actually saying, it's almost an exact quote, "Just because we're both on the Republican ticket does not mean I support Donald Trump." It was only after Trump was elected president that DeSantis saw his main chance to emerge as a defender of Trump in the Russian collusion hoax. I think this is probably the first time he ever came to Trump's attention. Then, at the behest of Matt Gaetz, Trump endorsed DeSantis. DeSantis went from 8 to 68 in the polls almost overnight, swept to the Republican nomination for governor. Because he had no grounding in state issues, he'd really been planning a U.S. Senate race. He brought on the extraordinarily capable Susie Wiles, who essentially put together very quickly a very efficient grassroots campaign for him, since his nomination was a manifestation of his appearances on conservative talk radio and Fox. And of course, he won by a very narrow 25,000 votes. And then only because President Donald Trump changed his schedule 3 times to visit Florida in the final weeks of the 2018 campaign to drag DeSantis over the finish line. So my prediction to you today is that this is a fake news, that Ron DeSantis will not be appointed the Secretary of Defense. I'm sticking with Hegseth. I know you are. As long as Donald Trump is for him, that's who I'm for. Any thoughts?
Roger, I can tell you that in Illinois, it was the never Trump base of the Illinois Republican Party that endorsed DeSantis over President Donald Trump, even though President Trump had nearly a 40-point advantage over DeSantis. It was these same officials like Richard Porter, the Republican National Committeeman, who said Donald Trump can't win independent voters in the swing states, and that MAGA supporters in their heart of hearts know that's just not possible. He was a deep DeSantis supporter. Another Illinois Republican Party leader, Jeannie Ives, also backed DeSantis over President Trump. So I can tell you in my firsthand experience, just here in Illinois alone, DeSantis's failed presidential campaign attracted all the never Trumpers. And so I couldn't imagine, I'm so glad with your analysis, I couldn't imagine that Ron DeSantis would be even considered for Secretary of Defense. And Roger, I'd have to think that MAGA has a very good memory.
Yeah, I think that's an excellent analysis. Obviously, there's been a lot of speculation here in Florida that Governor DeSantis would appoint Lara Trump, who I think did an exceptional job as Republican National Co-Chairman, particularly in the area of election integrity, where this time the party was extremely well prepared. For example, when there were irregularities in the voting in Butler, Pennsylvania. Party lawyers sprung into action, won important judgments there to provide for a fair, honest, transparent election. I think that that is unlikely, but there are some wags in the press who are now saying, oh, well, maybe there's a deal here. Maybe DeSantis will agree to appoint Lara Trump to the seat being vacated by Senator Marco Rubio, and in return, Trump will make him Secretary of Defense. First of all, Donald Trump doesn't operate that way. And secondarily, I think candidly, Governor DeSantis has his own designs on that seat. Let me explain how this works. Assuming that Senator Rubio resigns in January in order for his name to be sent to the Senate, where I think his confirmation as Secretary of State is virtually certain, because he is resigning in the first 3 years of a 6-year term, the special election for that seat would be held in November of 2026. That's at the end of Ron DeSantis's term as governor. DeSantis cannot run for another term. He's barred from a third term by the state constitution. So I have been predicting, continue to predict, that the governor of Florida will put a placeholder into the Senate seat, someone who will not run, and seek that seat himself in order to position himself for another run for president in 2028, in which he will once again be ignominiously defeated. I called this one very early. We have a little video here. It's controversial, but we're going to show it to you anyway.
Roger! My man, I didn't even see. How could I not see my right? God bless you. I'm going to give it a well.
That is back at a time, Mark, when I was taking a lot of abuse because I was telling people DeSantis is going to run for president against the man who made him, Donald Trump. And people saying, no, stop dividing us. Why are you saying that? He would never do that. I think I proved to be right about this. He's not trustworthy. By the way, the people who say he's a great governor, they tend to be the people who don't live in Florida. Our insurance rates are skyrocketing. The insurance on my car has tripled since Ron DeSantis has been governor. Our utility rates are at an all-time high after DeSantis took $9.5 million from Florida Power and Light and their various subsidiaries for his presidential campaign. His regulators approved the greatest single increase in electricity rates in Florida history. We also have a rising crime problem here in the country. So this idea that he's a great governor, I hear that from people in Ohio, people in Texas, people in Illinois. Don't hear that so much from people here in Florida. Another interesting development I wanted to touch on, by the way, David Schoen, the president's, I think, most effective impeachment lawyer, is going to join us momentarily for a discussion of what exactly is going on with Jack Smith and the cases filed against President Trump. Also analyze the Georgia case and what we may be looking at from the New York courts. But it is interesting, I don't know if you saw this, Mark, that the president nominated a North Florida sheriff, Chad Chronister, to be the head of the DEA. And then it became clear that during the pandemic incident, the pandemic problem, that Chronister had gone into a church in Tampa and actually arrested Pastor Howard Rodney Brown in the middle of the services in that church, trying to enforce the COVID law. Christian backlash was so overwhelming yesterday that President Trump announced that he would withdraw the appointment of Chronister. Rack one up for Jesus Christ. This was an outrageous appointment to begin with. You know, Mark, by tradition, U.S. senators are only supposed to oppose a nominee for a cabinet position on the basis of some malfeasance, some crime, some other disqualifying factor. They're not supposed to oppose the president's nominees because they don't agree with their political philosophy. That seems to be out the window here. Uh, I think the president's nomination of Kash Patel, you had a great show here when you guest hosted on the StoneZONE on this very subject. I think this is among the president's very best appointments. Watching acting FBI Director Andrew McCabe, a man who never even served as a station chief for the FBI, say that Kash Patel is unqualified. This is laughable nonsense. But I think the most important message, I think, for those who are out there listening to us, particularly if you live in one of these states like Alaska or Maine or Oklahoma, for that matter, is contact your senators. You go online, find their cell phone numbers, find their email addresses, be respectful, be polite, but make it very clear to your elected officials that you expect them to respect the mandate of the American people. You expect them to respect the mandate of the voters, and they need to vote for President Donald Trump's nominees. Now, Elon Musk, who's a man worth a few bucks, has said that he will finance primary challenges to those Republican senators who do not support the president's nominees. Mark, you have a very good understanding of Republican primary voters and how they work. I think this is a very potent threat, don't you?
I do, and there needs to be accountability. And what happens when you've got these U.S. senators that have been in there for so long that they forget who they're really supposed to represent? Their interests are no longer serving the people. It's serve me, serve is to serve us. And so it's no surprise that we're going to have these rhino senators oppose anything that President Trump, anyone that President Trump nominates. But here's what's very interesting, Roger, is that Rahm Emanuel gave a speech in Chicago yesterday, and he gave several media interviews. He was in town for Thanksgiving, and he had pretty harsh words for Democrats and for the establishment. And he said, you know, the Democratic Party used to be the party of the establishment, but what we saw on November 5th is that Donald Trump represents the anti-establishment, and that anti-establishment belief system is what the overwhelming majority of Americans represent. They are anti-establishment. And so this flies completely contrary to what these establishment Republican U.S. senators believe. And so I think it's great that Elon Musk is going to target them, because the only way to make a difference is to hold them accountable, put up strong primary challengers, and get some funding behind them and get them out of office.
Commercial break, and when we come back, Mark and I are going to interview David Schoen, one of the premier criminal defense lawyers in the country, a man who very ably represented President Donald Trump in one of the 2 impeachments, a lawyer who has specialized in civil rights, civil liberties, ballot access issues, really, I think, one of the leading legal minds in the country. Folks, only last week was the 61st anniversary of the murder of President John F. Kennedy in the streets of Dallas. If this is a historical issue that interests you, if you still wonder who really killed JFK and why, well, let me recommend my book to you. It is The Man Who Killed Kennedy, The Case Against LBJ. This is a New York Times bestseller. It is both heavily documented and heavily footnoted. And in it, I make the case that JFK was murdered as a result of I hate this word, conspiracy that involved not only the Central Intelligence Agency, organized crime, major financial interests, the banks, big Texas oil, the FBI, and the Secret Service. You can get your copy of The Man Who Killed Kennedy. You can get a signed copy by going to themanwhokilledkennedy.com. That's themanwhokilledkennedy.com. Now, you could go to Amazon or Barnes and Noble or some other multinational corporation that hates your guts and buy the book. And if you do choose to go there, by the way, get the paperback because it has 3 additional chapters. But I would urge you to go to themanwhokilledkennedy.com. And yes, I will personalize it for you if you wish. So it's an excellent birthday or anniversary gift, or if there's a history or political buff in your family and they're interested in this topic, which I think all Americans are still interested in, you can order your copy today. Many thanks. Mrs. Stone will be quite grateful. We have to keep the lights on here at the Stone Zone. All right, joining me now is one of the premier criminal defense attorneys in the country, David Schoen. He is a sole practitioner, specializes in complex criminal and civil matters, has made a specialty of civil rights, civil liberties, and ballot access issues, very ably represented President Donald Trump in one of the two impeachments. You may remember him. He was the lawyer on the Senate floor who showed that epic video of Democrat after Democrat after Democrat calling for violence and insurrection. David Schoen joins both Mark Vargas and I now in the Stone Zone.
Thank you very much for having me.
David, delighted to be back with you. David did my 77 WABC radio show last week. I'm happy to tell you it was the highest rating show we have ever had in the history of the show, both on Nielsen and also those listening online. Was a great show. We're going to cover some of the same ground here because the issues are very topical. Last week, I believe it was, probably it was the week before, the case against Donald Trump regarding the January 6th matter was dropped by special counsel Jack Smith, but they dropped it in such a legal way that the case could later be revived. I found this surprising. David, can you walk us through this?
Sure, and you're absolutely right. And I think what's particularly surprising is that dismissal without prejudice, which means, as you say, they can bring it again, potentially, was done on consent with President Trump's lawyers. That struck me as particularly odd. And my understanding is, they felt they didn't want that additional battle, but there really was nothing to it. In other words, Jack Smith had to file a motion to dismiss. It's the binding Justice Department policy that a sitting president cannot be indicted or be subjected to the criminal process in any regard. That same goes for a president-elect under the Presidential Transition Act. And the government has conceded that. Jack Smith's team, a memo written by Molly Gaston, another dubious member of the so-called public integrity section in Washington, D.C. I have a sanctions motion going against her for misleading a federal court. But anyway, that's an aside. So theoretically, Jack Smith, and certainly it's his intention based on the making sure that it was filed without prejudice, would like to bring this case again after President Trump's term is finished. Another option would have been to try to hold it in abeyance, but the memo makes clear the Department of Justice policy reflected in a memo October 16th, 2000, and again this year reaffirming it, piggybacking on a memo in 1973, it's clear that you cannot have these kinds of charges, criminal charges, hanging over the head of the institution of the presidency. It creates a stigma, it's a distraction, it's a separation of powers violation, and so on. So all the lawyers had to do was agree to the dismissal, but then fight the issue of whether it's with prejudice or without. There's a dangerous set of footnotes, 33 through 35, of the October 16, 2000 memo that suggests that maybe they could bring it again and that the statute of limitations would be told, frozen in time. So, given the attacks that we've seen from these folks over and over and over again without merit, it's not hard to imagine that they would try that after 4 years. It would have been worth it to try to fight against that.
An excellent analysis. Mark, you have a question for Counselor Schoen.
Yeah, we're hearing, the money wasted, $30 million is what I've been reading on Jack Smith's fake investigations of President Donald Trump. David, is there any mechanism in place to try and get that money back that was wasted?
I don't think there is. I think that money is gone and the American people were cheated, just as they've been cheated by all of the money spent on the Mueller investigation, which, Roger certainly knows very well. There was no basis for ever appointing special counsel in that case, let alone having it run by someone like Andrew Weissman, the single most ethically bankrupt prosecutor, in my opinion, that I've ever gone up against. No way to justify the Jack Smith appointment. Unfortunately, Merrick Garland, who, frankly, I had a case with when he was a judge. I found him to be an excellent judge, and I supported his appointment originally. He turned out to be nothing more than a political hack, I'm very sorry to say. And he really proved that point, by the way, if you didn't believe it beforehand, when he claimed executive privilege allowed him to withhold the video of the Biden-Hur interview. There's no basis for executive privilege to apply to that whatsoever. So you raise an important point. A lot of taxpayer dollars wasted. I would suggest to you the Democratic Party doesn't think they were wasted because they consider them to be PR expenses, more attacks against Donald Trump that frankly were not successful based on the election results.
Yeah, in that particular matter, it occurs to me there is indeed a precedence. When the existence of the White House recordings of President Richard Nixon became known, Nixon moved in the courts claiming that those could not be released because they were protected by executive privilege. The Supreme Court ruled, I think, almost unanimously against him, and of course the tapes were released, which ultimately brought down his presidency. I'm not sure why the same principle would not apply here. The idea that this recording by the special counsel of President Joe Biden was protected by executive privilege seems to be would not stand up on the basis of that precedent. But then I'm a non-lawyer, so.
But you're 100% right, Roger, and even more so. There was no way in which Joe Biden thought he was speaking to anyone in a privileged manner. He was being interviewed by a prosecutor looking to bring charges against him. No way would that be privileged. And Merrick Garland's just way off base.
Yeah, I see your point. Here's another question, which I really hadn't focused on until our radio interview last Sunday. As you know, Judge Cannon in Florida in the 11th Circuit dismissed the charges against Donald Trump regarding the so-called documents case by claiming that the appointment of Jack Smith was unconstitutional. She based on my reading of her ruling on the fact that Smith had never been confirmed by the U.S. Senate to have these sweeping prosecutorial powers, that there is no provision in law for a special counsel. There's no law that creates this position. There's no budgeting to pay for what was a multi-million-dollar investigation. And lastly, that no member of the executive branch can be unfireable by the chief executive. That matter went to the 11th Circuit, where it was challenged by Jack Smith, and everybody presumed it would ultimately go to the Supreme Court. Now, while the case against the president has been dropped, the case against the two gentlemen charged as co-conspirators with him has not been dropped. And presumably their lawyers, Stanley Woodward, a very able lawyer, represents one of them, will raise this question, or the question will continue to be raised in the 11th Circuit. And therefore, it would seem to me, regardless of how the circuit ultimately rules, I'm not certain how that comes out, this still could end up before the Supreme Court. And the whole question of the constitutionality of Smith's appointment, and therefore Robert Mueller's appointment, could yet appear before the Supreme Court. Is that analysis about right, David?
Yeah, but I wish when you would give the disclaimer that you're not a lawyer, you would explain that what you mean is you know more than 99.9% of the lawyers out there. No, it's an excellent description. No, that's right. I mean, look, I think as a practical matter, you will see Jack Smith has resigned already. I think you will see the case dismissed against all of them. I think the current Justice Department will come in and do it. And in a sense, why not? Because now the Trump administration will have license to appoint a special counsel based on the Democratic theory. An interesting twist on this, by the way, as you may well know, Hunter Biden's lawyer filed a motion to dismiss one of the prosecutions against him based on this theory that the appointment of the special counsel, Mr. Weiss, was unconstitutional. He has a tougher road to hoe there, actually, because Weiss had been a U.S. attorney, but still, the argument may well have prevailed. But I think the case will be dismissed as a practical matter. Jack Smith is gone. There's nobody really to carry it through. Um, but theoretically, yes, it could end up before the United States Supreme Court as to those remaining defendants, because the constitutionality of the appointment of the prosecutor who brought the case against them, Jack Smith, would still be a live legal issue.
Mark Vargas, next question to you.
David, I mean, President Trump has been harassed for years, costing his businesses billions of dollars, the character assassination, the money that he's had to personally spend on legal fees. Is there anything that President Trump could do legally to sort of fire back a counter lawsuit for this harassment, where Jack Smith can just say at the flip of a switch, okay, I'm filing motions, investigations are over, pretend this never happened, just kidding. Is there any legal mechanism that President Trump could use to fire back and push back on these targeted legal harassment cases?
Yeah, theoretically, there is a mechanism, especially if you could show the government's claims against him were not substantially justified. I think, he may just well want to move on, although he's, proven to be somewhat aggressive with the lawsuits in the past. But, that would also mean going all through the discovery process. And part of the reason we want these things to be over is because they are a distraction to the presidency. And, this would mean potentially taking testimony from him and all of that. So, yes, I think there is a mechanism. I'm not sure it would prevail in this case, and I'm not sure that it's worth it as a practical matter. I'd like to see it and move on. That's easy to say because I'm not the person who's been under attack mercilessly, not just for the last 4 years, but for 8 years. It started, with the Mueller Commission, as you well know. And that was part of their strategy. As Jerry Nadler famously said once, we can't rely on the voters to get rid of Trump. And so they try all of these extraneous methods and at taxpayer expense. And, the Trump haters cheer it on. You have a shadow team of prosecutors, Norm Eisen, Danya Perry, Joyce Vance, Andrew Weissman, and others who make up these model prosecution memos. We've never seen anything like it, frankly. It's a disgrace. And fortunately, President Trump, the election went his way. The American people, I believe, are fair-minded, and they were sick and fed up with this lawfare.
Let's switch, if we may, to the big news item which transpired between the time I interviewed you on Sunday and today. That would be the pardon of Hunter Biden. Now, this is kind of sensitive to me because people continue to go online and say, well, Roger Stone and his wife evaded $2.3 million in taxes, but he was not prosecuted. And this is unfair. It proves that Hunter was politically prosecuted. There are a number of substantial differences here. First, I reported every penny of income to the IRS, and I accurately pointed all of my assets. They brought a civil case against me simply based on my inability to pay. I do owe the IRS $2 million, of which 75% is interest and penalties. And this, by the way, are for my 2006 taxes, because I'm current for every year from 2006 forward. Also, every year since 2007, all 12 months a year, I have made payments to the IRS without ever missing a payment or even being late with the payment. And those payments over time have gone up depending on how well I'm doing, trying to make a living. They've also gone down because of the Mueller investigation, which left my wife and I virtually indigent, as I think you both know. We lost our home. I lost all my insurance. I lost my car. I had to sell my prized electric guitar. That one really hurt me. We really had no choice. But when Hunter Biden's lawyers raised this question at trial, saying, well, Your Honor, Roger Stone and his wife we evaded nothing. And frankly, I'll probably be paying the IRS until the rest of my life. Now, normally, in the offer and compromise system, you would be able to negotiate some reduction in the interest or penalties. The IRS has not been willing to do that. the toll, we're almost at the toll period. That's why these taxes would have extinguished, and that's why we ultimately settled the matter. But when Hunter Biden's lawyers brought this up in court in his case, the judge says, we reviewed Stone's case. This is the difference between apples and oranges. I resent this idea that we evaded taxes. It is false. I resent the idea that we got some special break. Yeah, we got a special break. We will be paying for the rest of our lives. Again, 1/4 of the amount that I owe is actually past due tax. The rest of it, almost all interest and penalties. Sorry, gents, but I had to get that off my chest. David, here's my question. Why do you think they backdated Hunter Biden's pardon all the way back to 2014 during the period that Joe Biden was vice president?
Well, I think why they backdated it is to protect Joe Biden. I think it's to protect him with respect to and certainly Hunter Biden, with respect to the Ukraine matters. Remember, President Trump was impeached the first time around simply for asking for an investigation, not a prosecution, an investigation of the dealings between Hunter Biden, Joe Biden, and the Ukraine, and that getting rid of that special prosecutor with the Burisma case, and so on. So this matter, I think the only reason it goes back that far is to try to protect for this matter. I think it could backfire because Hunter Biden no longer has a Fifth Amendment right with respect to any federal charges related to that. He's going to have to testify about Joe Biden's role in that matter if he's called upon to testify. There are also potentially legal issues surrounding the validity of this pardon. Before I get to that, I would say to you, just to piggyback on what you said about the apples and oranges, you may well have seen that the federal judge in the tax case expressed outrage in an order yesterday at the suggestion that there was unfair treatment, biased treatment against Hunter Biden in the tax prosecution, to which, of course, he pled guilty to felony and misdemeanor counts. That judge expressed outrage at the way Joe Biden handled the thing. But what's also interesting about the validity of this broad, non-specific pardon for crimes committed or which may have been committed, so unknown crimes, meaning, quite frankly, that as of November 30th, if Hunter Biden sold 10 kilos of heroin, as I have said before, he's given a pardon for that from any federal charges, as long as it was before December 1st. It's an 11-year, 10-year, 11-month broad pardon. So some writers from, let's say, the Brookings Institute, for example, who are Trump haters, during the Trump or after the Trump administration and before the Trump administration, when they saw him coming in, wrote articles talking about how President Trump might abuse the impeachment process. And there's a suggestion that a pardon, which is done for the purpose and with the intent in mind of protecting the president and his co-conspirators, might be an invalid pardon, drawing on early debates in the Constitution and so on. So that's one potential defect in it. And the other is whether it's valid to give a broad, non-specific pardon to crimes that we don't even know what you're talking about. So it's interesting how it plays out. But, obviously he gave dozen interviews, and so did his minions, that it would never happen. He believes in the justice system. To come out with this kind of statement that he did, the double standard, all of the things that have happened to Trump, he now claims have happened to him, that the Justice Department has attacked him. So in that sense, he supports President Trump, that it's a politically motivated Justice Department. But, he campaigned on calling President Trump convicted felon, which he's not. There's never been any judgment entered in that case. But anyway, all of this nonsense. And now, we see this very interesting article yesterday, by the way, to get a sense of Hunter Biden, by former mistress of his, who outlines the details, the drug use and all of that kind of stuff going on. It's a pitiful case, but it's offensive that after, suing people over the laptop and accusing the agents of lying and misleading and so on, that now we're supposed to feel some sort of empathy that he was the victim of this system. He wasn't the victim.
Kind of interesting that Senator Joe Biden was the sponsor of the bill that provides the harsh mandatory penalties for possession of a firearm while you're on drugs, which he is now, of course, as you know, hundreds of thousands of African Americans and other poor people have been subjected to prosecution under that law, but he's just pardoned his son for that very infraction. I also saw another legal analysis that said that if there was an investigation, let's say into payments that Joe Biden or members of his family took during the time that he was vice president, and therefore during a time in which he had no presidential immunity, that Hunter Biden would have no choice if he were called to testify. Because he's accepted this pardon, he would not be able to use a Fifth Amendment defense. David, is that accurate?
Yes, it is. And he could be charged with perjury or contempt if he refuses to. Now, that's the downside of this kind of pardon. And again, those who didn't like President Trump wrote article after article warning that, boy, it might be a good thing if he gives a full pardon to so-and-so, because then they'll really have to testify. I don't know if the House is inclined to go forward with inquiries about President Biden or not, but if they are, Hunter will have to testify. And I would warn this also, it's something I've argued vehemently against during the second impeachment trial. The Democratic Party's theory, the House managers put this in their brief, in the impeachment brief, is that any former president can be impeached from time immemorial. They could impeach Thomas Jefferson for holding slaves, or any former president. So Joe Biden is vulnerable to that, depending on if the House intends to, make further inquiry, or maybe they just want to move forward and let President Trump have his positive agenda to get the country righted.
Yeah, very interesting question. I don't know if you gentlemen saw this, but the trust fund baby congressman from Manhattan, Dan Goldman, on CNN yesterday said that Roger Stone blackmailed Donald Trump into giving him a pardon. That's a lie. David, you represented me in the sentencing portion of my trial. There is no evidence to support that whatsoever. Hakeem Jeffries said it in a tweet. I've saved that. But unfortunately, both of them hide behind their congressional immunity. So I have no ability to seek legal redress. There's no evidence of that whatsoever. In fact, after BuzzFeed sued the Justice Department to ultimately force them to disgorge the last remaining redacted section of Robert Mueller's final report, he admitted that he'd found no Russian collusion, no WikiLeaks collaboration on my part. And he goes on to say that even if he had found such evidence, which he didn't, he concluded it wouldn't have been a crime. This idea that members of Congress can vilify private citizens, say anything they want, and that they have no recourse because of their congressional immunity is particularly obnoxious. So this is the story about this today is very simple. Congressman Goldman, waive your congressional immunity. Prove your defamatory claims in court. Put up or shut up. I don't think we'll be hearing anything more about that from Congressman Goldman.
It's an outrageous lie. It's an outrageous lie. I'm familiar, as you know, with the situation. There's zero basis to it, less than zero basis, and you wouldn't still command the respect that you do with the administration and the friendship and all of that if there were any truth whatsoever to that. It's not in you, and it didn't happen. And maybe there's an exception to the speech or debate clause, depending on the forum which he said it and context and all that. But anyway, it's not worth your time to go after. There's no basis to it.
It is interesting to me that, of course, after I was pardoned, Andrew Weissman, who you have correctly identified as the most epically corrupt prosecutor in U.S. history, said Stone can still be dragged before a grand jury now to testify what he knows about Trump. With all due respect, Mr. Weissman, you had 3 years to bring me before the grand jury. You never did. You conducted this investigation in secret, but constantly leaking it as a pressure tactic. I could have been called to the grand jury at any time. But if I were compelled to testify, I would have nothing to say. I know of no misconduct whatsoever by Donald Trump. There was no Russian collusion. There was no coordination with WikiLeaks or any other crime that I'm aware of. The whole thing is a canard. People understand the purpose was to pressure me to testify falsely against the president, and that I refused to do that. I thank God that the president was able to see what was going on here, that this was a baseless political persecution. By the way, My testimony before the House Intelligence Committee was voluntary. And for you to violate the False Statements Act, not only must your statement be willful, it must be material, meaning it had to hide some underlying crime. But Mr. Mueller could never identify any other underlying crime because there was none. Those who say that Trump, now that he's in office, that he wants retribution, that he wants revenge, I reject that idea. I think what he wants is a recalibration, a rebalancing of the scales of justice. We need to have one criminal justice system. John Brennan, the CIA director, went before the U.S. Senate and lied under oath about him spying on a Senate committee that was investigating his illegal use of torture, but he wasn't prosecuted. James Comey lied under oath multiple times before the Congress regarding material matters. Of course, he wasn't prosecuted. Hillary Clinton, of all people, she lied under oath to Congress repeatedly, but she was never prosecuted. No, this isn't about revenge or retribution. I think it's about a criminal justice system that is based in the rule of law. It was interesting. I saw an interview with Weissman the other day in which he said he wasn't worried about his own prosecution because that would be decided by grand juries and by judges, as if there is no evidence of malfeasance or misconduct or illegality on his part. Now, David, since he and his colleagues loved writing memos to the Justice Department outlining the alleged crimes of Donald Trump, maybe you should take pen to paper and send the Justice Department a memo regarding the alleged crimes of one Andrew Weissman, because they go all the way back to his days as a prosecutor in Brooklyn, in which he covered up mob murders by Sammy the Bull. And then, of course, when he suppressed exculpatory evidence and had other misconduct in the Enron case, in the case against Arthur Anderson, in the case against Merrill Lynch. He also famously, when the cell phones of the Mueller prosecutors were subpoenaed by special counsel John Durham, he destroyed evidence. That's obstruction of justice, I believe. There we have two systems of justice here in the country. Mark,
Roger, let me give you. I just want to interrupt 1 second. Let me give you one example so your viewers and listeners know just how far back this goes and how disgusting it is. Andrew Weissman, back in the 90s, was a prosecutor in a mob case in which a corrupt FBI agent was later charged with murders on behalf of the mob. He had picked a side in the Colombo War and so on. Of all of the prosecutors in the case, Chief Judge Sifton singled out one, Andrew Weissman, for a suggestion that he should be taken to the bar for his what he called myopic view of his ethical obligations and discovery obligations. The U.S. attorney for the Eastern District at that time intervened, wrote a letter to the judge asking him to remove Weissman's name from the order, and the judge complied. I have a copy of both orders and the letter. I've never heard of anything like that in my life, and Weissman took it clearly as license to do what he has done since then.
Yeah, it is. His public comments are kind of beyond belief. But he and his friend Norm Eisen seem to be very, very upset about something. And then I saw Jake Sullivan. Now, I remember very specifically, Jake Sullivan was well aware of the fact that the claim that Donald Trump had a computer terminal at Trump Tower that was directly connected to a Russian bank, and that he told Hillary Clinton that she could go ahead and say that publicly. That he knew that was false at the time, yet he has paid no penalty for that at all.
Roger, with the Hunter Biden matter, they enlisted the services of former intelligence officers who we had held up as credible leaders in the intelligence community to say that the laptop was part of a Russian hoax and Russian intelligence effort and all of that. That's extraordinary. That should never happen again. And when you say President Trump now wants to, not vengeance, but wants to sort of right the ship, that's what's required. We've never seen anything like this. And you mentioned that Hillary Clinton got a pass. Your viewers and listeners should know that Robert Mueller was working for the law firm that represented Hillary Clinton, and a member of his staff was her personal attorney.
Yeah, that's, by the way, the same woman who was the chief prosecutor in my case. When Robert Mueller was brought before the House, he actually said he didn't know that. He was unaware of the fact that his law firm had represented Hillary Clinton. How likely is that? Every prosecutor in my case had previously worked for the Clintons in another incarnation, every single one of them, but we expected them to be unbiased prosecutors. Mark, your final thoughts on this legal issue, and then we'll let David go, and we'll talk a little bit more politics. Final thought.
You know what, David, it's laughable that Joe Biden now is claiming a selective, prosecution of his son Hunter. But I just want to ask you just one quick question. Supreme Court Justice Stephen Breyer said that these uncontrolled prosecutors are a threat to the separation of powers. As brilliant as our founding fathers were, they never envisioned these out of control prosecutors and special counsels to have this much unbridled power. Is there anything we could do in the Trump administration and having control of both chambers? Is there any language that we could put together or any mechanisms in place to at least rein this in and balance things out a little bit?
It's a great question. One of the great justices of all time, Robert Jackson, wrote a very important article, became a speech about the danger of the rogue prosecutor. I think that what Congress can do with the prosecutors is to really impose greater sanctions for misconduct. Literally, I've had a sanctions motion pending for now maybe 2 years against these folks, J.P. Cooney, Molly Gaston, and another woman from that public integrity section for literally lying to a federal judge to get a lawyer's email records and so on. There have to be more teeth, more of a disincentive from prosecutors for overreaching. We've seen too many cases now in which that's really ruined lives and so on. We're going to see now as this thing, by the way, pans out in Georgia, since Fani Willis, apparently the office lied and said there were no communications with the House January 6th committee, Benny Thompson, or with Jack Smith. And Jim Jordan came up with a letter from 2021 in which Fani Willis asked for assistance from Benny Thompson. We're going to see how that plays out now in terms of rogue prosecutors.
Absolutely fascinating. All right, I think we're going to leave it there. I guess on that final note, David, will the Georgia case ultimately be dismissed in your opinion?
Has to be. It has to be dismissed. The prosecutor may try to hold it in abeyance, but for the same reasons underlying the Justice Department memo, all of the distractions that it causes, separation of powers issue, the supremacy clause issue, and so on, supremacy clause issue, it has to be dismissed, finished with. It's even a simpler case than the New York case, and it ought to be done now. Listen, I'm glad they're getting this other information meanwhile and showing about the lies, but the case has to be dismissed. All of this has to be put behind them.
I guess that leads to one other final question. That is, we still have pending the Alvin Bragg case, the so-called hush money case in New York, in which the president has, I think, unjustly been found guilty. As I understand it, he cannot appeal the case until he's sentenced, and sentencing has been postponed. This is another case that I think just personally ought to be dismissed. But how do you think this plays out?
Has to be dismissed. I'm afraid, though, knowing Judge Merchant as I do, that he's going to go. Remember, the prosecution in that case now has said, well, okay, let's hold it in abeyance during the 4 years, have it hanging over the president's head, and stop it now, hold it in abeyance. On Monday, this past Monday, President Trump's lawyers filed a motion to dismiss, recounting some of the previous arguments, but the main focus is to be on the election immunity, the immunity that arises from him being now president-elect and soon to be the sitting president. I think that Judge Merchant, given his record in the past, will probably go with the prosecution, agree that it should be held in abeyance. At that point, it is 100% true that the underlying conviction can't be appealed until there's a judgment entered. Judgment isn't entered until there's a sentencing. But I believe there can be interlocutory appeals of the immunity rulings in the case for the case to be dismissed and eventually could be taken to federal court over it, may end up in the Supreme Court over it, or President Trump could agree to waive his immunity, get sentenced, and then appeal the entire conviction. I worry about any implications for that for any other claim of immunity, but there are a lot of options out there. I'm not positive that Judge Merchant will do the right thing for now, but eventually that case will have to be dismissed.
All right, we're going to leave it there. Let me thank our guest, David Schoen, criminal defense lawyer par excellence, one of the guys I go to for the very best legal analysis in the country. As I said, our show on 77 WABC last weekend, the highest rating show I've had since President Trump. He's the only one who beat your ratings, David. We're very proud to call you a friend and to have you on the show. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you very much, both of you.
All right, Mark, let's talk for a moment about the Illinois Review. Where can people go to follow some of your great independent journalism?
Thank you, Roger. Well, on Facebook, Illinois Review, on X, Illinois Review, and IllinoisReview.com, the largest conservative, pro-Trump, pro-MAGA news publication in Illinois and in the Midwest.
All right. I want to thank Mark Vargas for dropping us in with us today and filling in for Troy Smith, who's not feeling all that well today. I want to remind you folks that you can go to the app on your phone and download the Rumble app. And when you do, you go to rumble.com/Roger Stone, hit that little follow button up there in the corner, and then set a notification. You have several opportunities to see us here at the Stone Zone. You can see us at 4 o'clock Central at worldviewtube.com. That's 5 o'clock Eastern, or later at 8 p.m. by going to Rumble at rumble.com/Roger Stone. There it is once again. Until tomorrow, my thanks to Mark Vargas for joining us here in the Stone Zone. God bless you and Godspeed. We'll see you tomorrow.
A man who's gone through hell, but he's kept going, and he's smart, and he's strong, and people love him. Not everybody, but people love him and respect him. Roger Stone. Where's Roger Stone?